In the hush that followed her husband's final breath, Pastor Shirley Caesar stood alone, in a silence more deafening than any sermon hall she'd ever known. 31 years of marriage had woven her life into his, each memory a thread of love, joy, and shared purpose. Yet in the instant he slipped away, the tapestry unraveled, leaving her vulnerable, exposed, and unexpectedly unmoored. Imagine the woman whose voice once shook church walls now grappling with a stillness so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. That is where our story begins. From the moment Shirley rose to sing in that small Durham chapel at age 7, she carried a burden far heavier than her years. The daughter of a tobacco factory worker and a mother with a paralyzed leg, she learned early that survival demanded sacrifice, not comfort. While other children dreamed of play, Shirley's earliest lullabies were hymns of hope offered in exchange for pennies to feed 13 mouths. And yet, it was precisely that burden that forged her voice. A voice so charged with emotion that grown men wept, not from pity, but from an undeniable recognition of shared humanity. Fast forward 4 decades, and that same voice, a testament to resilience, would grapple with a crisis no performance could redeem. When Harold Ivory Williams passed at age 93, Shirley's role shifted overnight from partner in ministry to solitary steward of a legacy, both spiritual and material. As news of his death spread, her beloved congregation emerged, candles in hand, to mourn. But mourning in public could not resolve the private storm that brewed when Harold's 2 children from a previous marriage questioned Shirley's right to lead or to inherit. The promise of co-pastorship, once a beacon of unity, became the spark for a bitter estate battle that would engulf her in accusations she never saw coming. Contrast the generosity that defined her career, giving away 75% of her earnings to feed the hungry, with the harsh reality of stepchildren who saw only dollars and deeds, not the decades of shared sacrifice. Contrast the laughter that echoed down church aisles at her vibrant praise services, with the hush of legal proceedings in sterile courtrooms. It's here we encounter the heart of Shirley's tragedy, a woman who had spent her life binding wounds and healing souls, now finding herself the target of family wounds she could neither sing away nor pray through. And, as if betrayal weren't enough, rumors surfaced. Whispers online claiming she had died, stories asserting she'd lost her faith, half-truths painted as gospel. Each false report struck like a jab to the ribs, depriving her not only of privacy but of dignity. These weren't mere clickbait headlines, they were assaults on her essence, attempts to redefine her narrative without her consent. Yet, in this maelstrom of grief, betrayal, and rumor, Shirley Caesar found a paradoxical refuge. The same faith that had carried her through Jim Crow segregation, cancer scares, and career setbacks whispered that her voice, her truest gift, remained intact and inviolable. This is no ordinary obituary. It's a portrait of a heroine besieged not by enemies abroad, but by conflicts within the very family she'd nurtured. It's the story of a woman who knew what it was to sing for her supper, to preach for her family's survival, but who had never anticipated singing for her own vindication. And yet, as the next chapter unfolds, we bear witness to a transformation. For Shirley Caesar, heartbreak has always heralded a higher calling. The loss of her husband might have silenced her at the altar of personal pain, but it could never still the thunder of her testimony. So here, at this crossroads, we pause, not merely to mourn but to marvel, to ask, how does a woman who has given so much of herself continue to rise? When the very ground beneath her crumbles, how does she find grace in the face of accusations, clarity amid chaos, and ultimately, peace when every voice around her insists she's lost? In the sections that follow, We will trace her journey from that quiet hospital room to the courtroom steps where her future hung in the balance. We will uncover the moments of doubt that almost broke her, the unexpected allies who lent their strength, and the enduring truth that in her darkest hours, Shirley Caesar's greatest tragedy proved to be also her most profound testament. The church sanctuary was drenched in morning light, dust motes dancing like tiny angels around flickering candles. Mourners filed in under a vaulted ceiling, their whispered prayers weaving a soft lullaby for a congregation still reeling. At the front, a towering portrait of Bishop Harold Ivory Williams greeted them, an icon of wisdom and warmth framed in gilded splendor. Shirley stood just beyond view, her hands trembling as she smoothed the folds of her black choir robe. Each breath felt like a sermon she wasn't ready to preach. The organist struck a single minor chord, and the hush that followed seemed to echo the emptiness she carried. Every face in that pew held a story of shared hope and love, but in the hush, Shirley felt profoundly, devastatingly alone. A lawyer's office smelled of worn leather and whispered regrets. Afternoon sunlight streamed through dusty blinds, cutting bars of light across a scarred oak table where the will lay waiting like a loaded trap. Shirley watched as the attorney cleared his throat, his eyes flicking between her and a stiff-backed woman she barely recognized, Hope Williams, Harold's daughter from a previous marriage. Across from her sat Harold Jr., arms crossed, jaw clenched so tight she imagined she could hear the snap of tension. "Your father left specific instructions." The lawyer began, voice steady but cool. He slid a thick envelope toward Shirley. She braced herself. Step by reluctant step, the document revealed clauses she had never penned: property transfers, ministry assets, even personal effects nearly promised to the children she had loved like her own. The room spun, heart pounding like a drumline of betrayal. Shirley felt the blood leave her head. Not once in 31 years had she sensed hesitation in his voice when he called her co-pastor. Not once had she been anything other than partner, spiritually and legally. Yet here, written in ink, lay the evidence of doubt cast by his own blood. She swallowed hard, cheeks burning, as Hope leaned forward. "Mom, we love you," she said, voice trembling with a practiced sincerity. But Dad's wishes were clear. Shirley wanted to fling the papers aside, to scream that she had built every brick of their shared dream. But she remained seated, tears unbidden and spite cold at the back of her throat. Later that night, in the quiet of her study, Shirley traced a cracked photograph of her father's gospel quartet, just come for, back when tobacco dust stained their Sunday best. She remembered the rhythm of hope they carried into sweaty church foyers. She remembered how her mother pressed 5 cents into her small hand before every service. "Sing for us," she'd say, "and bring water back in your pockets." At 7, Shirley's voice had to be armor. At 20, a proclamation of endurance. Now, it must be her shield against legal assault. The burden felt heavier than any she had ever borne, yet a faint ember of that old fire ignited inside her. A reminder that she was forged in sacrifice. That ember grew warmer in the days that followed. Shirley's faith, once a gentle stream, surged into a river of conviction. She recalled the endless nights of prayer before awards ceremonies, the countless hospitals where she laid hands on strangers and whispered promises of healing. She whispered one more promise now. To herself, she would not be defined by betrayal. She would stand firm. Yet beneath that vow lay a tremor of doubt. How does a woman who has sung through lynching threats and segregation trials find the words to plead for her own legacy? Word spread through Mount Calvary's pews like wildfire. Some deacons rallied to her side, offering legal expertise and heartfelt letters. Local news outlets smelled conflict and camped at her gate. At the grocery store, congregants passed, whispered condolences alongside whispered outrage on her behalf. In the midst of those testimonies, published and impassioned, one name surfaced time and again: Pastor Elaine Thompson, a lawyer turned minister who had once sued a national broadcaster for defamation. Elaine reached out with an email of solidarity, then showed up at Shirley's door, bearing both legal briefs and casseroles. The gesture cut through Shirley's loneliness, like sunlight through storm clouds. Here was an ally who understood the intersection of pulpit and courtroom, belief and bureaucracy. When they convened in Elaine's office, the walls were lined with books that smelled of justice case law, moral philosophy, civil rights histories. Papers spread across a polished table, charts of assets and timelines of marriage certs and property deeds. Elaine's tone was calm, methodical, reminding Shirley that faith need not be a passive shield. "We'll fight this," she said, voice as steady as the press of her hand on Shirley's. Not for revenge, but for truth. In that office, surrounded by legal tomes and fragrant casseroles, Shirley found fresh resolve. She would defend her place not just as widow, but as the steward of a spiritual and material legacy built by shared sacrifice and faith. That night, back in her Raleigh home, Shirley scribbled notes on yellow legal pads. Each clause she challenged felt like another stanza of a sermon she needed to preach. Would she win? The question hovered as ominously as any chord of suspicion she'd ever confronted. She rose from her desk and looked at the framed lyrics of "Jesus, I Love Calling Your Name," a song born from her near-death bus crash. She had belted those lyrics through hospitals and auditoriums, yet never had their promise of resurrection felt so essential. As moonlight brushed the window, she whispered her next prayer, not for her husband's return, but for strength to reclaim her own story. A quiet determination took root. The fight for her inheritance would become the fight for her very voice. The courtroom doors swung open like a stage curtain, revealing rows of polished benches and a judge's bench elevated like an altar. Shirley stepped inside, shoulders squared, heart drumming with a tension she hadn't felt since her first solo performance. The smell of polished wood mingled with the faint scent of ink on legal filings. Cameras clicked from the press gallery, but Shirley focused on the solemn faces around her: the bailiff, the stenographer, her own legal team, and across the aisle, the steely gazes of Harold Jr. and Hope. The judge rapped her gavel, and the trial began. Not a trial of faith, but a trial of inheritance, partnership, and the right to carry on a shared dream. Elaine Thompson stood and addressed the court, her voice a measured counterpoint to Shirley's once trembling responses. "Your Honor," Elaine said, "this case is about more than property lines and bank account numbers. It is about the covenant formed in marriage and ministry, sealed by decades of sacrifice." She laid out receipts for charity donations, detailed congregation growth charts, and letters from deacons affirming Shirley's leadership for 31 years. The flicker of surprise on the defense attorney's face was the only applause Elaine permitted herself. Shirley's breathing slowed. Each fact Elaine presented chipped away at the foundation of the opposition's argument. When it was Shirley's turn to speak, she rose like a prophet called to testify. She spoke not in legalese but in scripture. "As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another," she began, voice steady. She recounted her shared journey with Harold. How they had built the church from a handful of worshippers to tens of thousands, how they weathered hospital wards and segregated buses, how they gave their finest gifts to a higher calling. Tears gathered in Hope's eyes, not from sorrow but recognition. Even Harold Jenner's jaw softened halfway through the testimony. In that moment, Shirley wasn't pleading for money. She was reclaiming her story. Outside the courthouse, congregants gathered in clusters, murmuring prayers, clutching programs printed with "Justice for Pastor Shirley." Flyers had circulated on social media, linking to a GoFundMe for legal fees. Local radio stations broadcast excerpts of the trial, and calls poured in to the church office. Some supporters soared into full-throated hallelujahs, others whispered solemn petitions. The streets buzzed with the energy of a spiritual revival, albeit one fueled by controversy rather than carols. For Shirley, that wave of support felt like a second anointing. But even as public sentiment tilted in her favor, the opposition dug in their heels. Harold Jenner's attorney claimed Shirley had mismanaged funds, pointing to a year-old audit showing minor bookkeeping errors. A separate witness, a former church accountant, testified that some outreach payments lacked proper documentation. The insinuation was damning the woman who had given away 75% of her income, might have misappropriated the remainder. Shirley sat stone-faced, but inside old insecurities whispered, "What if they're right? What if your devotion blinded you to the details?" That night, back home, Shirley replayed every moment in her mind, attending to both triumphs and stumbles. Sleep eluded her, so she rose and wandered through the sanctuary alone. The pews were empty, the organ silent. In the dim glow of candlelight, she ran her fingers over engraved hymnals, each line a testament to lives changed through worship. She imagined her father's deep quartet, harmonies filling the rafters, her mother's determined hands stirring pots in the church kitchen. She realized that the true measure of wealth wasn't dollars or deeds, but faithful stewardship of gifts God had bestowed. Clarity rose like dawn. She would not shrink from scrutiny, but embrace it as part of her service. The next morning, Elaine presented a counter audit by a renowned accounting firm, showing 98% of donations accounted for, and no evidence of personal enrichment. Witnesses, former board members, testified that every penny Shirley managed went directly into missions, benevolence funds, or church expansion. The opposition's case began to collapse like a house of cards. Cameras flashed when the judge excused the defense's expert witness after cross-examination revealed inconsistencies in his record keeping. Shirley, sitting to one side, exhaled for the first time in days, the weight of doubt lifting from her shoulders. On cross-examination, Hope's voice trembled as she admitted her own gratitude for Shirley's mentorship. "I wouldn't be the woman I am without her," she confessed, tears tracing down her cheeks. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Even Harold Jenner, usually so guarded, nodded once, as if acknowledging an unspoken truth. In that charged silence, Shirley felt the cords of betrayal loosen. She realized that even when flesh and blood falter, faith can bind bruised hearts together. A week later, the judge returned to the bench, robes rustling. He praised both sides for their decorum, but noted that the evidence overwhelmingly favored Shirley's claim. He upheld her right to maintain control of ministry assets and awarded her a fair share of the estate by legal statute and moral contract. A hush fell, then applause rippled through the courtroom. Rare, reverent, almost hymn-like. Shirley closed her eyes and thanked God, not for victory, but for vindication of truth. Word of the verdict spread faster than wildfire on dry grass. Mount Calvary's doors burst open Sunday morning as worshipers poured in, waving banners that read, "Just Judgment," and "Blessed are those who seek justice." Shirley ascended the pulpit in radiant white, her smile luminous. Before the sermon began, she paused, letting the congregation's cheers settle into reverent silence. "This is not about my inheritance," she began, voice strong. "It's about the inheritance of faith we leave to our children." She spoke of forgiveness, reconciliation, and the power of truth to heal wounds. Many wept, some stood to applaud. In that moment, victory and ministry intertwined like threads in a tapestry. Later that afternoon, Shirley sat with Harold Jr. and Hope in the church parlor, hands clasped around cups of sweet tea. They shared memories of their father, his laughter, his sermons, his unwavering devotion. Voices trembled as they laughed and cried together. The estate battle hadn't erased past hurts, but it opened a path toward healing. Shirley realized that her most profound legacy wasn't the church's property or her net worth. It was the love she poured into every soul she met, the faith she embodied in every trial. As evening fell, Shirley walked alone into the sanctuary once more. She knelt at the altar, whispering a prayer not for legal victory, but for grace to continue her calling. The hush enveloped her, familiar and comforting. Then she lifted her head, feeling the resonance of her own voice, steady, unbroken, ready for the next chapter. The tragedy had tested her, but it could not define her. Her greatest testimony lay not in the headlines, but in the resilient heartbeat of her ministry. Shirley passed through the sanctuary doors with a quiet confidence distinct from her arrival in turmoil months before. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting the pews in hues of ruby and gold. The same rafters that had witnessed her childhood hymns now held the resonance of her vindicated voice. Yet, Shirley knew that legal triumph was but a waypoint in a journey marked by constant renewal. Healing, she realized, doesn't occur in a courtroom. It unfolds in the daily acts of service, compassion, and faithful witness. Her next steps would define not only her personal recovery, but also the destiny of a ministry she'd fought so fiercely to protect. In the following weeks, Shirley immersed herself in work that had once defined her life. Alongside Harold, she visited outreach centers in neighborhoods battered by poverty and neglect, handing out groceries and encouraging weary mothers. She met with youth groups, her presence a living testament to resilience. For every handshake and hug, she thanked God for a second chance, not just in court, but in the hearts she could uplift. Behind these simple gestures lay a profound contrast. The same woman who had stood in a judge's chambers, defending her inheritance, now knelt beside hungry children to ensure her legacy was measured in nourished souls rather than secured deeds. Meanwhile, the estate battle's headlines faded, replaced by stories of Shirley's renewed generosity. Local papers ran features on her decision to increase scholarship funds for seminary students from underrepresented communities.